Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Oh, that was the weakest good morning I've had all day. Well, you know those little things at the back of a car, the bobblehead? You know what I mean? They go like this. You ever see that? So if I say bobblehead, it's my way of asking if you understand what I'm saying. So if I say bobblehead, go like this if you understand. If not, go that way. So does everybody know what bobblehead means? Bobblehead? Okay, thank you. All right, I'm so glad to be with you. I've been in the area now for around 22 years. I hail from New York, and then to California. I'm a little bit like a song by Neil Diamond, if you remember that's from my generation, in which he wrote, LA's fine, but it ain't home. New York's home, but it ain't mine anymore. So I'm a little bit stuck between two shores. And I am, of course, a damn Yankee, and I only realized that damn Yankee was one word when I finally came here, below the Mason-Dixon line. So I'm going to give you a bit of a lecture called While Standing on One Foot. There were two sages. One was named Hillel, lived 2,000 years ago, along with a guy named Shammai. And the person who wanted to become Jewish went to Shammai, who was very strict, and said, tell me about Judaism while standing on one foot. Well, unless you're a yoga expert, you can't stand very long on one foot. So he says, give me the bottom line. And he said, that's ridiculous. I don't want to reduce the Jewish faith to one saying or whatever. And he hit him with a stick and threw him out of the school building. Then he went to the more lenient and loving Hillel, who said, yes, what's hateful to yourself, do not do to your neighbor. That's the whole tradition. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. So he gave a version of love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule, but he put it in the negative. What's hateful to yourself, don't do to your neighbor. There's an old thing that I think it was Sir Bertrand Russell once said, I can't love my neighbor as myself, because what if I like to hit myself? It means I won't be very nice to my neighbor. So this is the short form of Judaism that I'm offering you. It's like a three-legged stool in which you have God, Torah, read tradition for Torah, and Israel. I'm going to explain all three of them and then welcome questions toward the end. Everybody understand what I'm going to do? Bobblehead. Okay, great. Amazing what you get adults to do just by asking them. Try it again. Bobblehead, right? Okay, good. So the first thing we talk about is God, whatever God is. Could also be understood as just general spirituality. Now God, in the Jewish tradition, you have two kinds of ways of looking at the divine. The picture of the guy at the computer, God as a computer nerd, does not cover what Judaism around. You can't define God in Judaism, because God is what's called transcendent, as opposed to immanent, which means real close, I get to know God, right? Now, don't listen. Shh, shh. Christianity has a leg up on Judaism psychologically. Some would say also theologically. But why psychologically? Because God came down to earth, either Lord Jesus or Son of God. And you make movies about him, right? And you put him on walls. And I got to break it to you, he didn't have blonde hair, and he looked more like a Jewish businessman from New York, probably dark-eyed and a little dark complexed. Well, not only that, you give him a birthday party once a year, right? He's the only birthday boy that doesn't get the presents. Everybody else gets presents on Christmas, but not Jesus. Okay. Well, it reminds how he got presents when he was in the stable and all that. So that's very imminent. God's right there. Judaism, you ask a rabbi what God is, it could be this, it could be that. So we have lots of names for the divine. And the first thing that you see up there is Elohim, which means the plural, the all-encompassing, like in Hinduism, Brahman, the all God that is everywhere and every when and every powerful possibility, also omniscient. Then there's a name for God that Moses got at the burning bush, in which he said to the bush, you know the story about the burning bush? Somebody, yes? Right, he says, I go to Pharaoh, if I tell him a bush sent me, it's going to be very embarrassing. You're talking to bushes, right? So he says, well, tell him that my name is this four-letter name, which some Christians render as Jehovah or Yahweh Well, you could have it Yahweh, you can have it my way, but we don't know the way of actually describing the divine. But it means something like the eternal one. Having fun yet? Okay, good. All right, so Yahweh is the eternal one. Then there's another name in Judaism for the divine, God the Master, El Shaddai. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the three patriarchs in the beginning of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, knew God as the shadow, overwhelming shadow God, powerful. Shekhinah means the divine presence. It's a feminine word for God, which you might render as goddess in our culture. Then Adonai is, well, Adonai just means the Lord. Sometimes it's used instead of that name up here, the four-letter name of God, because you don't want to take God's name in vain. And some Jews just say the name, Hashem, referring to God. Even that becomes very powerful. People don't use that glibly anymore either. Then there's a view of God as Hamakom, the placeness, the place where you encounter spirituality. Like in the story of the patriarch Jacob, where you saw angels ascending and descending on a ladder, or we really don't know if it was a ladder. There's one, it's a Hebrew word, sulam. You know what sulam means? Anybody? Nobody knows what it really means because it appears only one time in the Bible. It's a Hebrew word. It's called a hapax logamenon. If ever you want to impress someone when you're on an airline, just turn and say, did you know that there are 16 hapax logamenons in the Bible? Words that appear only once, and we only guess what they mean. So with sulam, he was going up and down. The angels, it meant something like an escalator. For all we know, it could have been a Star Trek beaming out kind of thing. We just don't know. But it was some kind of ascension and up and down. And that was the word hamakom, the place where God is experienced. The most favorite word that expression is Ein Sof, which means the one without end, the one you can't define. No matter what you do, you can't define. Because if I call God as love, at that moment I'm not experiencing God as thoughtful or caring. Not that God is not caring or thoughtful, but the point is I'm limiting God. And Judaism is big about not limiting the divine. One of the quarrels, don't tell anybody. How many of you Christians? Everybody raise their hand. Okay, you're at Spartanburg Methodist. The problem that Judaism had with Christianity was when you say God took the form of a human being or dwelt, or was Jesus Lord incarnate, is that's kind of limiting. God is everywhere. How can he be in a human being? So that's a dispute, and it's been going on for 2,000 years, and we ain't solved it yet. Okay, viva la différence, differences. Okay, moving on. So that's God. That's the first leg of a three-legged stool. Everybody with me on this bobblehead? Good, having fun. Then the Jewish Bible is called the Tanakh. It's also called the Hebrew Bible. Christians got a hold of it, and you took it. And you rendered it into the Greek, and then into the Vulgate, the Latin, and then Tyndale, and then it was put into the King James Version, and then it was in hotel drawers thanks to the Gideons, and so that you could steal it. Actually, they wanted you to take it. So if you feel guilty, you're now absolved. You could have taken the Gideon Bible. They don't mind. Okay, so the Jewish Bible is different. The Jewish Bible is not the Old Testament, though for all intents and purposes it's very similar. It's different in some ways in which I will describe in a moment. So that's the first part of the Jewish tradition, is the Hebrew Bible, which then became the Old Testament, the differences in which I'll address in just a moment. Then Jews have a second work. If the Christians have the New Testament, which is the response to the Old Testament, Jews have a work called the Talmud. And I'm going to explain what that is. It's a huge encyclopedia of Jewish lore, L-O-R-E, and law, L-A-W. So one of the things that I want to make clear to you is a lot of Christians see Jews as, oh, all you got is the Old Testament. You're half Christian. You're only halfway there. Well, we're full way there. We have not only the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, which has 3 parts to it, which I'll explain in a moment, but it also has a companion piece, this encyclopedia called the Talmud. Okay, everybody with me so far? Bobblehead, doing good. Okay, so we have other works as well, Midrash, interpretation, which I'll go over in some measure. So here's a picture. It's very hard to see, but this is the Jewish Bible. And one of the things that you'll notice if you look at it is the order is different. The order is different. The Christian version of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, ends with Malachi. Why is that? Since you ask me, I'll tell you. Because it predicts that a prophet is coming by the name of Elijah. And who is Elijah? In both Jewish and Christian tradition, he's going to welcome the Messiah. And who's the Messiah in the Christian tradition? Everybody together.
Jesus.
You got it. You get an A, everybody. So you're going to end the Old Testament with a promise of Elijah being the announcing of the Messiah, the herald. And then you turn the page, you get to the New Testament. Matthew is not the first one written down, though it appears first. Then you get to Mark, and in the beginning words of the New Testament, you have a voice crying in the wilderness. Who was that voice crying in the wilderness? John the Baptist. Very good. And he is considered Elijah in many Christian traditions. So you organize the Hebrew Bible differently in the Old Testament as a launching pad to the New Testament. The Jewish tradition is different, however. It ends with Chronicles, which has an interesting tale at the end where the Babylonian king who exiled the Jewish people some 2,500 years ago, he's having dinner with one of the descendants of King David. King David is very important. He is the ancestor of the Messiah, both in Jewish and Christian tradition. Other differences are in the order. One of the things you'll see is that the book of Judges is up here in the Christian Old Testament, and the book of Ruth, this woman who was a Moabite woman, becomes Jewish. She had a husband who died, and she was loyal to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and she's up here. Why? Why? Since you asked me again, I'll tell you. The reason is because it says in the very opening lines of the book of Ruth, it happened at the time of the judges. So clearly, you're going to put Ruth up here. The Jewish tradition says, nothing to it. We're going to put it down here in a section that's called the writings, where you find the Psalms, and you find Proverbs, you find Ecclesiastes, to everything turn, turn, turn. Am I still communicating with everybody? Doing okay? Great. So that's the Hebrew Bible and the differences between the Jewish arrangement and the Christian. Now, I talked to you that there was a work called the Talmud, right? The encyclopedia, the answer, if you will, to the Hebrew Bible. Again, the Old Testament, you got the New Testament. The Hebrew Bible, you then have a work called the Talmud. Now, what is Talmud like? More important than the answers it provides are the questions. So here are two stories from this vast encyclopedia of Jewish lore and law. The first one is about two guys that I'll talk about in a moment who are burglars. They're thieves, okay? And so the story begins with a rabbi who is approached by a farmer. And the farmer says, I want to learn the Talmud. I want to learn all about Jewish tradition. And this rabbi is not very nice, unlike yours truly. And he says, you're too stupid. You're a farmer. You're illiterate. He says, please, please. He says, okay, I'll give you a test. I'll give you a test. If you pass the test, you get to study the Talmud with me. You get to understand Jewish tradition. And the farmer goes, deal. So here's this test. There are two burglars, frick and frack. They're robbing a huge mansion, going down a chimney, right? And the rabbi says to the farmer, as they emerge from the chimney, one of them has soot all over his face, right? It's nighttime, but he has soot all over his face, and the other one doesn't. And so the rabbi says to the farmer, okay, who goes to wash his face? The one with soot on his face or the one without? And the farmer says, clearly, it's easy to answer. The one with soot on his face has to go wash. The rabbi says, I told you you're just a moron. You're a farmer. You don't get it. You see, the one who has a clean face looks at the one with a dirty face and says, my face must be dirty. But the one with the dirty face looks at his partner who has a clean face and says, my face must be clean. So he doesn't wash while the other one goes washing. Aha, says the farmer, I get it. No, you don't get it, because I told you it was nighttime. How can they see each other's faces? Ah, said the farmer, now I get Talmud. That's not enough, you still don't get it. They're robbing a house, it's stealth. They're trying to do thievery. Do they have time to go take a bath? Okay, so one question leads to another question. And you know what the final answer is? There is none. There's just more questions upon questions upon questions. And the questions are far more important than the answers. So that's one example. The other is a story of cows and chimneys. Okay, it says somewhere in, I think it's in the book of Deuteronomy, forgive me, I'm not a fundamentalist. It says that if a cow wanders into your backyard, you got to return them by eventide, late afternoon. Okay, so a cow, what shall we call her? I think I gave you a suggestion. Her name is Betsy, the milk cow. Okay, Betsy, everybody together, moo. Okay, so she wanders in. She doesn't speak Hebrew very well. She doesn't speak English. She doesn't have a name tag, no brand. But you want to follow the Bible, right? You want to return her by eventide, by late afternoon. But you can't. So what do? Well, let me ask you. You would then want to advertise. How many times would you advertise? For a week? 2 weeks? Would you take pictures of her even though it's 2,000 years ago and there are no photographs available, right? So let's say you take 2 weeks, right? A fortnight. Lost, a cow named Betsy, a milk cow. Come claim her. No one claims her. So what do? You start milking her. You start feeding her, right? And one night you're hearing strange voices coming from the corral. She's fallen in love with your prize bull by the name of Norman. And they're in love. They're doing the horizontal mambo together. And 10 months later, bad rabbi, sorry. 10 months later, who arrives? Little Sydney, a little calf. Well, it so happens that the owner of Betsy shows up. He says, I've been in Europe at Club Med for a year, relaxing and vacationing. And that's my Betsy. How have you been? Where have you been, you bad cow? And he says, well, it's your cow. And he shows photographs and bill of sale. And the farmer who claimed the cow for a year says, okay, you take her, but we got a problem. What's the problem? Problem is she's in love with Norman. We can't separate a husband and wife. Not only that, they have a kid. So you know what? You have got to buy my bull and you've got to buy the calf. Okay, says the original owner. But you know what? You've been milking her for a year and making a lot of money off of the milk cow. Therefore, I'm subtracting all the money that you made from the sale of the bull and the calf. Oh, yeah? And he says, yeah, but you know what? I had expenses, veterinarian expenses, and grain expenses. So it's a simple story? No. But the Talmud has all sorts of questions about life, how you live, how you organize yourself, the way in which we try to get along one with the other. So this is a story, two prominent stories in the encyclopedia, of which there are thousands more. There are lots of traditions in Judaism. There are 613 commandments. You all know the top 10 commandments, which are what? Don't steal, honor your father and mother, which is very difficult. It's very hard to raise parents in this day and age, wouldn't you agree? And you have others like don't covet, don't be jealous of your neighbor, don't commit adultery, don't try and live like you're in California, do all sorts of things that are reprehensible. In addition to the top 10, you got another 603, like returning the cow, okay? Like all sorts of things, like wearing special garments, giving charity, and looking at every possible way that you elevate yourself by keeping what's called a mitzvah, a commandment which could also be rendered as a good deed. Walking the little lady across the street, helping her with her packages, seeing someone on the street that hasn't got a meal. How many of you have ever been begged by someone to give you a buck, okay? Did you do it? I have, not boasting, Sometimes I haven't, okay? And I feel guilty, Jewish guilt all the time. Okay, so These are some of the traditions. Now, the central tradition of Judaism is called Shema. Shema meaning, listen, O Israel. The Lord, Yahweh, the Eternal One, is your God. That is a central declaration of Judaism. Jews, at the moment that they're breathing their last, will declare that. I remember my father, may he rest in peace, he used to watch this film with John Wayne, who was a draft dodger in World War II, but you wouldn't know it from all the films that he made. Anyway, John Wayne, he went and made a film called The Sands of Iwo Jima, where they raised the flag, and there was a scene my father would just wait to see in which a Jewish soldier got shot and was dying, and his last moment he declared, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And John Wayne goes, amen, brother. Okay. My father would go, yes. Why? Because as a minority, I ask students regularly, how many Jews are there in America? What percentage of Americans are Jewish? Anybody? Take a guess.
Like 0.5%?
Well, it's not that, it's not more than that, but you're close.
5%.
Huh? 5%? 2%. Maybe 2.5%. Jews are prominent sometimes because we're just brilliant. And we study, we listen to our Jewish mothers. They get a degree in college. It'll only cost you $150,000. And so we excel in some ways. Now, this is a little braggadocio because of our emphasis on education. What percentage of Nobel Prize winners are Jewish? 20%. Okay. For our people that occupy less than 1% of the world's population, that's pretty darn good. Okay. That doesn't mean other people don't have their gifts. They have great gifts. Every part of the human family has special gifts that they provide for one another. So we're going to turn slightly to another issue as well, and then we'll deal with this. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. That guy listened to Eve, munched on that apple. All of a sudden they realized, hey, we ain't got any clothing on. You know what? We can do something when we can take a bath with each other without water. I mean, really. So they discovered sexuality. The word know in English is different than the Hebrew, which means I had intimate relations with her. Adam knew his wife. So the story in part, the snake didn't lie. The snake says, you're going to have your eyes open and you'll be like gods. How are they like gods? How are we like God? The one feature of God is that God is everlasting, eternal. So when I make Xerox copies of myself called babies, and those babies grow up and they make more babies, in some sense I'm passing on my DNA and I'm living forever. I have that quality of eternality that only God has. Following that, bobblehead? We're good. Okay, so the Christian, not all Christians, I don't want to paint this with a wide brush, a lot of Christians will say you are born in sin. You may have been born in the state of South Carolina, which could be the same thing, but you're born in sin. And how do you get redeemed from being in a state of sin? You don't want a Jewish boy to have to spell it out for you. How do you get rid of your being in a state of sin? You believe in Christ, his sacrifice for you, because he carried the sins of the world on his shoulders. That's normative Christianity as I understand it. Your chaplain will maybe correct me and articulate it much more profoundly than I just did. Judaism doesn't say that. Shocking, we're different. Okay, Judaism talks about having two different impulses. The will to do good, helping the little lady across the street without being asked, and the will to do evil, which means our appetites. Our appetites, which could be sexual appetites, it could be aggression, it could be territoriality. So, if there's a guy here, he's not here, I'm going to talk to an invisible man. I'm talking to an invisible man. And I say to him, hey, you see that beautiful girl there? What does he want to do when he sees the girl? What does a million years of evolution tell him to do?
The sexual drive.
You're being very poetic. He wants to touch her. He wants to involve him. So he wants to be like Adam knowing Eve, right? But since he's civilized, instead, what does he do? He controls his impulses because he has a will to do good, and instead of touching her and being inappropriate, trying to be like Donald Trump, oh dear, I went the other way, I can't believe it. I got it out of my system. I'm sorry, not really. So instead of being like Donald Trump, he walks up to the lady and says, "Hi, would you like to have a cup of coffee with me?" And then they move on to the safe lunch. Brings her flowers someday, wine, gifts, jewelry. And then he gets to do what his monkey mind originally wanted to do. He sleeps with her, but not before he meets the family. And they give him a kosher stamp of approval, okay? And they get married, and that impulse, that negative impulse, that will to do evil, that aggression is channeled in a good way, and next thing you know, he's buying diapers. And he's taking care, he's having the joy of having a little bambino. Let me tell you, I got 4 kids that I know about. Let me tell you, it's difficult. No, I don't have 4 kids. 4 kids. I hope, stop the recording. 4 kids that I know about. Anyway, and each of them seemed like a good idea at the time. Let me tell you, you know, can I be crass for a moment? Is that okay?
Yes.
15 seconds of pleasure, a lifetime of responsibility. Okay. So, there it is, everybody. That's the Jewish way of looking at things. The last thing before we welcome questions and interactions, 2 things. One is Jews are this worldly. We have lots of views of the afterlife, including reincarnation. My students ask me, do you believe in reincarnation? And I say, no, I do not believe in reincarnation, but I did in my last lifetime. Get it? Bubble it? Okay. All right. So there's lots of views, but we're more concerned. We have the idea of the resurrection of the dead, when the Messiah comes and the world is transformed into a heaven. Rumor has it that Christianity really liked the idea of resurrection, really focused on that one, big one, headlines. He arose 3 days later. Wow, fantastic. It makes for great movies, let me tell you. Okay, except for Mel Gibson. Toy. Okay. A raging anti-Semitic. Now, this is proof that there's God. You all know who Mel Gibson is?
Yes.
Passion of the Christ, right? Well, he was in Santa Monica drunk as usual, and he was stopped for weaving and whatever, drunk driving, which is a terrible thing. You can kill somebody or yourself, and yourself. And his luck was in Santa Monica, the guy who arrested him was a Jewish cop. And he started spouting anti-Semitic tropes. The Jews run everything in the world. And then after the middle of his rant for like 2 minutes, Mel Gibson said to him, "You wouldn't be Jewish." And the cop went, "Yes, I am." His luck, the only Jewish cop in Santa Monica had stopped him. This is proof that there must be a God. Must be. I can't figure it out any other way. Okay, so the idea then of the afterlife is always present in Judaism, but it is not foremost in our minds, which is very different than many Christians. There was a guy who tried to convert me when I was in college. He kept talking on me for a half hour. And finally he said to me, "You know, I can't wait to die and be with Jesus." And I said, "You know, I've been listening to you for 25 minutes, and I also can't wait for you to die and be with Jesus." So these are some of the aspects of Judaism. The last one I want to share with you, and then open it up for questions. I know I can go on for hours, and I think I just did. Well, here's a question. There are many levels of understanding the Bible. We're not fundamentalists, okay? So let me throw out a question. You ready? Why did the chicken cross the road?
To get to the other side.
To get to the other side. Well, that's a simple response, and it's correct. However, the Jewish tradition says it's got to be more complicated than that. What would be the question you would ask about the chicken going to the other side? Why is that chicken going to the other side, right? So then you have another level of interpretation. What would be the reason the chicken's going to the other side?
Other chickens.
There's another chicken over there. He wants to play mahjong with him or something, right? Or her husband, the rooster's on the other side, or her nest is on the other side, or maybe there was something, a predator on the side wherein the chicken was residing. So you have already 3 levels: the literal, the hint, and the interpretation called midrash. But there's one more. It's called the sod, the mystical secret. Why did the chicken cross the road? You think this is about a chicken? This is about your soul. The chicken represents your soul. And all of us make journeys. Whether it's Caesar crossing the Rubicon, or Buddha having enlightenment at the river, or it means about us then ascending to the beyond after our death, where our soul gets to be with God. So this is not just about a chicken. It's about much more than that. So those are the levels in which you look at a particular tradition. Judaism is really interested in digging deeper, other traditions as well. If you ever had the pain of being with a Jesuit priest, let me tell you, they don't talk in sentences, they talk in paragraphs. They're brilliant, they really are. And they're very, what I call Talmudic, asking hard questions. And I think I once interrupted some guy. I said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your sentence. He says, I don't speak in sentences, I speak in paragraphs. And it's true, you can see the page that's in his head. So that's it, that's what I want to tell you. And now you have questions. I'm here to answer. You can reject what I'm saying, you can argue with me. I love questions of every sort. Don't be shy, I was once your age.
So I would like to ask you just this one quick one. In your opinion, what is the best thing Judaism has to offer to the world?
Interesting question. That was the question, I'll repeat it, I hope you all heard it. What does Judaism offer to the world? Elie Wiesel, who is the Holocaust survivor, preeminent writer, you really want to get an insight into what Jews often think, especially since Holocaust thinking pervades our consciousness. Read his book, Night, N-I-G-H-T. Anyway, he said in response to that question, and I would agree with it, he said, well, Christianity has given great architecture, music, and the like. And other traditions have given, the Muslim peoples gave us astronomy and algebra. And he said, what did the Jews give the world? We gave the world words. The fascination with language, as I've tried to share with you. Law, of course, is important in Judaism, but the basis for law is communication, is language, how we communicate with each other. Sometimes I have conversations with a person of another faith and take the word, for example, grace. Whole different meaning for some Christians than it does for Jews. It takes me an hour to understand, what the heck are you talking about? And vice versa, and vice versa. They say, what do you mean by law? You mean something strict with getting whipped with a whip? No. It's a whole different thing. It's the mitzvah. It's getting closer to God by fulfilling one of the commandments. It's a connection to the divine. In the mystical tradition, it's raising all the sparks of creation that came apart and reuniting them with the source of all being, which is the divine. So that's a great question, and I thank you for it. Anybody else?
Is Judaism have a struggle between denominations the way Christianity does? I was raised personally Pentecostal and Baptist, and my parents, just because my dad's dad was very Catholic and my dad was very not, and there's sort of that rub off.
Yeah. So the question is about what I would call speciation. You know, humanity just loves to speciate and be different forms. I once read a statistic, I think it's relatively accurate, and that there's 25,000 different Christian denominations or churches in America. 25,000. I think the Lutherans have at least 16. You have the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin, and it goes on from there. Jews, of course, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. You have basically Orthodox Judaism, which understands the Bible far more literally and feels bound to keep all the commitments that are called the commandments. Then you have conservative, which moderates a great deal, talks about revelation changing, and then Reform Judaism, the heretical form of Judaism, which is me, in which you say, you know, I'm not going to follow the dictates necessarily of the things that came to us from the Bronze Age. Okay, so there's lots of things that are changing in different ways. There's another, this Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox, very mystical-minded Jews. Right now, with the events of what's happened in Israel and Hamas, Jews have actually drawn closer together. There's an old saying that a healthy Israel stops kicking, and when we get kicked, we sometimes gather our strength and unite and move past our differences. There's an analogy that the Jewish people are like a lamb. If one limb of the lamb is wounded, doesn't matter, the whole animal swells up with pain, right? So it's a great question, and it deserves at least a 6-week response that I can't provide. But we have that in common with all religions, in which we bifurcate and trifurcate and quadruplicate and do all sorts of things that make us look at things somewhat differently. The French say, "Vive la différence," great, the more the merrier. Does the heart say to the spleen, "I'm better than you"? We need each other. Okay, so it's a great question, but it can be very confusing, especially if you have a mixed background in which I'm this and you're that. There's an old Irish melody about the orange and the green, where his mother was Irish, orange, and his father was green, and they were contesting religious sympathies in Ireland. And he said he didn't know what to do. Didn't know what to do. Bill Maher, you guys ever watch Bill Maher? Not at all, huh? He had a father who's Catholic. He was raised Catholic. He said, I have a Jewish mother. So he said, I had a Catholic heart, but a Jewish mind. He said, when I went to confession, I brought my lawyer with me. Forgive me, Father, I've sinned. You know Mr. Levine here. Anyway, so there's that. Good question. I thank you for it. Anybody else?
One of the submitted questions was, as a student, and they didn't give their name, asked, how can non-Jews help fight against anti-Semitism?
I think by doing what you're doing today, which is to be open as you did with Ibrahim Hanif, the Muslim devotee. I know Ibrahim very well. We've done panels together, and we gain understanding by just having conversations one with the other. I think it's important for students, people of all stripes, students, adults, teachers, to learn their history. Right now, if you turn to some of the broadcasts from Israel, there's some Israel news shows, you get a whole different picture of what's going on with this war in Gaza than you sometimes get from, frankly, in my opinion, which is a little bit sensationalized. And it's a horrible war. Every war is horrible. And I think Israel is just in a terrible situation. Every war has been an existential war for survival. Having said that, when we don't know how many people, the figures, there's liars, damn liars, and then there's statisticians. And Hamas, I wouldn't trust them with their figures, but let's say, okay, it's not 30,000, maybe it's only 15,000. That's still a horrible thing, especially when children are pulled from the rubble. One of the things I try to mention to students when I talk about Israel, not to justify violence, it's just the most horrible feature of humankind or our endeavors. But in order to get rid of Nazism and to free Western Europe from fascism, we had a project called Overlord, the Invasion of Normandy. And few people remember how many French citizens died in that effort. Not soldiers, 20,000. 20,000. So that doesn't make it better, but it makes it at least somewhat clearer about what's going on. Having said that, I think there's no winners in war, and my heart is bleeding. There's 100+ hostages, some of whom are Americans, that are still being held. The stories of October 7th are gut-wrenching. A woman, as she was being raped, had to listen to the screams of her baby who was put into an oven and being baked to death. This was an atrocity such as we've not seen since World War II and the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jewish folks perished, 2 million of which were children. So no easy answers, and it's just hell on earth, and I hope it ends sooner than later. I believe personally in a two-state solution. How you get from here to there is beyond me. I don't know, though I would read, I think Brett Stevens just had a piece trying to figure a way out of this mess in which the Arab nations would have a mandate, such as the British and the French had in the Middle East, to take care of Gaza and the West Bank. But it's, you know, they used to say about South Carolina, which seceded from the Union in 1861, I think it was, and said, you know, South Carolina, it's too small to be a nation, but too big to be an insane asylum. So Gaza is really a nation state. It's kind of hard. It's really a 25-mile strip, 6 to 12 miles wide. It's really, really small to be a state. With the West Bank, maybe. So it's a very it's a horrible situation. Okay, anybody else, please? I don't know what time it is.
Got time for probably one more.
One more question. Yeah, you're back. Yes, what's your name, by the way?
My name is Michael.
Hi, Michael.
So just on the questions of anti-Semitism, and I know you kind of gave the answer, but how do we build between people from Abrahamic cultures, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism? You know, how do we sort of build those relations and get rid of this animosity, particularly in regards to Jewish and Muslim communities?
Well, this war, of course, it was so traumatizing for Israel that the reaction, as we had after 9/11, was to just go full force. And so, what's a justifiable war versus a war of vengeance? And you know, your guess is as good as mine. It will be the repercussions will be felt for decades. It's going to be as ugly a reality as we can come up with. Bit by bit, you know how you move an elephant, toe by toe, and there are lots of things. I personally have worked long and hard, and Chaplain Tim knows this, in interfaith relations. I helped set up the Interfaith Alliance. I organized a trip called the Pilgrimage of Peoples to Washington to see the Native American Museum, the Holocaust Museum, and the African American Museum. Excuse me, there were 40 of us, and it was wonderful for us to all learn about each other's pain and our history, the ups and the down. So it happens in small pieces. I think having classes such as this to have open discussion, not necessarily to agree about everything, but to just listen and hear. In my tradition, there's an old saying that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we can listen more and speak less. And I got to tell you, if talk was cheap, I get mine wholesale, so I don't always follow that. Okay, but that's a great question and a most pivotal one. And you know, there's a wonderful song by a folk singer, Tom Paxton, says, "Love, let there be love, and let it begin with me," corresponding to a Christian hymn that I think many of you might be familiar with. And that's it.
All right, well, let's thank you, Rabbi Yossi, for being here. And I'm going to turn off the camera.
Okay.
And